My name is Alicia Martin, and last night I stepped into something I still can't fully process. I had just come back from the supermarket, keys still warm in my hand, expecting a quiet apartment and a sleepy baby. But the moment I pushed the door open, the world tilted. My son, my Jonah, was hanging over the balcony. My father-in-law held him by the waist, his arms stretched past the railing like Jonah was nothing more than leverage. My husband was beside him, frozen in place, breathing hard, his eyes glued to Jonah, as if he was watching a disaster in slow motion. I didn't even notice the grocery bags slipping from my hands until they hit the floor, but even that sound disappeared under the words my father-in-law threw at me, sharp and controlled. "Do as I say, or I'll let go." His voice didn't crack. That terrified me more than the threat itself. He sounded steady, certain, like he had arrived at this moment on purpose. Jonah kicked once, just a small, helpless motion, and I felt my entire body lock up. My mouth opened, but no words came out. My legs refused to move. All I could do was stare at the man who claimed he loved my son, holding him over 4 stories of empty air. My husband whispered something, maybe begging, maybe reasoning, but my father-in-law didn't acknowledge him. His eyes stayed locked on me, studying every flicker of fear on my face, waiting for a reaction he knew he would get. For 1 second, I told myself this was some kind of breakdown, a moment of lost control, a man pushed too far. I was wrong. I didn't realize this wasn't madness. It was a plan. Before I tell you what he wanted and how far this night went, follow the channel so you don't miss the rest of the story. Something about the week before that night had left a faint mark on my instincts, though I didn't understand it at the time. It began when my father-in-law, Norman Martin, stopped by without calling first. He walked into the apartment with a steady, unreadable expression, then moved straight toward the balcony as if he had come for that reason alone. He tested the latch on the sliding door, pushing it open and shut, with deliberate pressure, watching the lock click back into place. When he asked, "You keep this closed most of the time, don't you?" His tone pretended to be casual, but his eyes stayed fixed on the railing as if he were calculating something. I answered yes, though the question felt oddly specific. Norman didn't leave the door immediately. Instead, he leaned out to study the height, the bars, and even the concrete ledge below. The inspection lasted long enough for unease to crawl up my spine. When he stepped back in, he looked toward the ceiling corner. "Didn't you say you were installing a camera here?" he asked. I told him we were planning to. He nodded once with a slight tilt of his head that carried more meaning than his words. Then he walked toward Jonah's playpen. The moment he stood over my son felt different. Not affectionate, not amused. He stared with a stillness that didn't match how grown men usually look at babies. Something about his gaze hollowed out the air. And then he muttered low enough that I almost doubted I heard it. "Some people don't deserve what they have." My breath caught. I didn't know if he meant me, my husband, or someone entirely outside this room. When he finally lifted his eyes, he softened his face so quickly it felt rehearsed, as if the earlier moment had slipped out against his will. Elaine Martin arrived shortly after, her energy filling the apartment in a way that pushed every quiet thought aside. She bent toward Jonah and brushed his cheek with a fingertip, whispering words that didn't sound like a grandmother's affection, something about a child being meant for a greater purpose. The phrasing was strange too, grand too, intentional. When I asked what she meant, she smiled with an expression that concealed far more than it revealed. It wasn't playful. It was knowing. Their younger son, Tyler Martin, showed up later that day. Usually he was talkative, but this time he barely lifted his eyes from the floor. His shoulders remained tense, and he stayed near the hallway as if he didn't want to enter the living room fully. Every question I asked about his classes, his plans, anything was answered in short, clipped phrases that felt like placeholders instead of real responses. He seemed uncomfortable in his parents' presence, and several times he checked his phone, as though he were waiting for something he didn't want to hear. Meanwhile, my husband, Evan Martin, was carrying a stress he wouldn't name. For days he had been pacing at odd hours, staring too long at bills spread across the counter, and responding to my questions with reassurances that sounded like lines he had practiced. When I found a letter from a loan company shoved behind a stack of unopened mail, the truth began to take shape. Evan wasn't handling normal work pressure. He was buried under debt he had kept from me, and the shame of it clung to every move he made. The tension that followed him around the apartment wasn't the kind of stress that fades after a good night's sleep. It was the kind that eats away at decisions, judgment, and trust. All of these details collected quietly across the week, each one small on its own but unmistakable when placed side by side. Nothing dramatic happened yet. The atmosphere in our home had shifted into something I couldn't define. And though I didn't know it then, every one of those moments was pointing towards something I never imagined. The air on the balcony felt unnaturally still, as if the night itself was holding its breath. I moved closer with slow, deliberate steps, trying to keep my voice steady even though every nerve in my body was firing at once. Norman positioned himself with such precision that it didn't look like a man acting on impulse. He looked like someone hitting predetermined marks on a blueprint. Jonah's legs dangled helplessly and the small sounds he made carved straight through my chest. Evan stood off to the side, tense and shaking, whispering pleas that never reached the part of Norman's mind capable of empathy. I could feel the cold metal of the railing before my fingers even touched it. My instinct screamed at me to lunge forward, but logic, thin, trembling logic, told me that any sudden movement could trigger him in the worst way. When I addressed him, he didn't react to my words so much as the cadence of my breathing, the direction of my eyes, the tension in my hands. He studied me like an examiner waiting to see if I passed or failed a test I didn't know I was taking. I asked him what he thought he was teaching us. He responded with a calmness that made my skin crawl. He said people only recognize value when they see it slipping away, and he wanted to make sure I understood exactly what that meant. Before the meaning fully settled, his fingers shifted. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a jerk or a violent shove. It was small, precise, almost gentle. And then he released Jonah. My scream ripped out of me so fast that it felt like it wasn't my own voice anymore. I threw myself against the railing, gripping the metal so hard it cut into my palms. The world rushed downward with my eyes locked on the tiny body falling through open air. But instead of the brutal impact my brain braced for, Jonah dropped into the center of a wide, dark sheet, stretched tight in the narrow space below. The fabric arched downward under his weight, then bounced him softly before settling like a net designed exactly for his size. My mind refused to process it at first. Relief and horror collided all at once, leaving me dizzy. The sheet didn't look improvised. Its corners were secured with perfect tension. It was placed precisely under the balcony, exactly where a fall would land. Someone had measured distance, width, height. Someone had set this up before I came home. Then a figure stepped into the light. Elaine emerged with a stillness that was almost ceremonial. She didn't run. She didn't panic. She simply walked toward the sheet with slow, deliberate movements, her expression unreadable. She lifted Jonah into her arms with a practiced grip, not tender, not careless, controlled. His cries pressed against her shoulder, muffled but painfully real. She didn't look up immediately. For a second she just held him as if confirming he was intact. Then she raised her head and met my gaze with a calm that sent a cold rush through my spine. It wasn't shock. It wasn't fear. It was intention. Evan bolted for the door, but his reaction was almost background noise to me now. My focus locked entirely on the scene below Elaine, adjusting Jonah's position against her chest, turning her body to shield him as she began walking toward the side gate. The sheet sagged and fluttered as she stepped around it, abandoned the moment it served its purpose. Every detail snapped into place with brutal clarity: the angle of the sheet, the timing, the positions, the absolute lack of hesitation. This wasn't chaos born in a moment of instability. This was choreography. They had coordinated roles. They had prepared props. They had assigned tasks. Norman's cold focus, Elaine's timing, the placement of the sheet, none of it belonged to an impulsive act. It was a demonstration. And I understood then, with a clarity sharp enough to cut, they hadn't only planned for Jonah to fall. They had planned for me to witness it. And they were only getting started. The instant Elaine disappeared with Jonah in her arms, something inside me switched from panic to a cold, focused desperation. I followed the officers back inside while they asked for access to our exterior camera system. My palms were damp, and my throat felt raw from trying to force out words that never fully formed. The officers connected their tablet to the network and pulled up the footage from the past hour. No one spoke as the progress bar loaded. When the video finally opened, the room stilled. The first frames showed the yard from an overhead angle. Norman entered from the left side of the screen, walking with a steadiness that made my stomach twist. He didn't look frantic or confused. He moved with clear intent, pausing only to glance upward as if checking the balcony height. The officers exchanged looks without saying anything. The video continued. Down below, Elaine walked into the yard carrying the folded sheet in her arms as though it weighed nothing. She didn't rush. She didn't hesitate. She stepped into position and shook it open with controlled precision. The thin fabric spread in the air before settling into a wide rectangle. She looped each corner around the metal hooks of the fence posts, hooks I had never noticed before, hooks that must have been installed earlier without my knowledge. My chest tightened as the officers leaned closer to the screen. The footage zoomed in on her hands. Each knot was tied with deliberate efficiency. Then the camera angle shifted as Norman leaned slightly over the balcony railing. His posture wasn't frantic. It was calculated. The officer, nearest to the tablet, paused the footage so sharply that the audio of the tap echoed in the living room. The freeze frame showed Norman with a firm grip on Jonah, his feet aligned, his weight centered. There was no stumbling, no slip, no misjudgment. It looked like choreography. From behind me, I heard uneven breathing. Evan stood with his arms at his sides, fingers twitching against his jeans. His face was pale, eyes fixed on the screen, but refusing to settle on any single detail. The officer asked if he recognized the behavior as something unusual. Evan hesitated long enough to make every second feel heavier, then said, "Maybe they panicked. Maybe it wasn't what it looks like." The air in the room shifted. I turned toward him so fast it made my vision jerk. His voice didn't waver out of confusion, it wavered out of fear. Or guilt? The officers didn't hide their reaction. Their brief glance toward each other said more than words could. One asked Evan to clarify, but he backed up a step and muttered that he wasn't sure what he meant. The officer didn't push him, but his posture straightened, signaling a new level of suspicion. On the other side of the room, Tyler stood stiff against the wall. His shoulders hunched inward and his hands were clasped so tightly that his knuckles blanched. He wouldn't look at me or the officers or the screen. When I asked if he had seen anything earlier, he whispered a quick no, shaking his head too many times as if trying to shake off a memory rather than a question. The officers continued reviewing the footage, scrubbing back and forth through the moments before the fall. They analyzed the alignment of the sheet, the angle of Norman's stance, the timing of Elaine stepping into place. Their quiet professionalism only amplified the nightmare unfolding in front of me. Nothing about what we watched suggested a reaction. Everything suggested preparation. Deliberate, coordinated, intentional. My throat felt tight as I watched the people I thought I knew become unrecognizable. Evan defending his parents with a sentence that made no sense. Tyler shaking as if he carried a secret he didn't dare reveal. Elaine disappearing with my son in a vehicle ready and waiting. Norman orchestrating it from above like it was routine. The officers played the footage one last time, slower, highlighting each synchronized movement. With every frame, the truth pushed deeper. I wasn't fighting confusion anymore. I was standing in the middle of a calculated act, carried out by people tied to me by marriage, people who had just shown me that family meant something very different to them than it did to me. The house felt hollow by the time the officers stepped outside to coordinate with incoming units. The silence pressed against my ears like something physical when a faint knock sounded from the hallway. I turned and saw Tyler lingering by the doorframe, his posture tight, his jaw clenched, as though he had rehearsed every step required just to enter the room. I told him to come in, and he did, but slowly, like each movement carried its own weight. He sat opposite me without meeting my eyes, his shoulders rising with every shallow breath. When he finally spoke, his voice scraped out as if unused. He said he needed to explain why he had been acting strangely long before tonight. I didn't interrupt. I just let the words come. He described the moment Norman confronted him with a binder full of printed statements, numbers, circled margins, annotated everything tied to Evan's mounting debt. It wasn't a discussion, he said. It was leverage. Norman made it clear that if Tyler didn't cooperate with whatever plan he was crafting, he would expose everything in a way that would pull Evan under and drag me with him. Tyler said he tried resisting at first, but every attempt triggered a new warning, a new implication of consequences he wasn't willing to test. When he reached the part about being told to stay available and silent, his voice faltered. Hearing him describe the pressure, the manipulation, the fear, it didn't excuse anything, but it created a picture far darker than I expected. Before I could say a word, a sharp breath came from the hallway. Evan stepped inside, stunned, as though he had walked into a conversation he didn't know could exist. Tyler repeated everything slower this time, his face turning red with shame. Evan's expression shifted from confusion to disbelief, to something that looked almost like betrayal. He didn't speak for several seconds, then muttered that he never asked his father for help, that he never wanted anyone involved in his problems. Tyler flinched as though the denial hurt more than the truth. The air between them tightened, and for a moment I thought the brothers might collapse under the weight of everything unspoken, but the door opened again before anything else could break. A man entered wearing a plain jacket and a badge clipped to his pocket. He introduced himself as FBI Special Agent Andre Cooper, assigned to the case after reviewing the surveillance footage and the severity of the abduction. His tone was measured, steady, the kind that didn't need volume to command attention. Agent Cooper explained that based on everything gathered so far, Norman and Elaine appeared to be moving quickly and deliberately. They were likely shifting locations, avoiding predictable patterns, and staying ahead of law enforcement. He asked if anyone in the family had been coerced or threatened. Tyler raised his hand before he could finish the question. The confession came again, but this time Tyler didn't stumble. He laid out the timeline, the pressure, the instructions, the fear he carried every time his father called, and Agent Cooper listened with the focus of someone assembling a puzzle at high speed. When Tyler finished, the agent leaned back slightly and said there was a possibility to use that connection. They needed someone Norman trusted, someone whose presence wouldn't raise suspicion, someone who could enter the next conversation without setting off alarms. Tyler froze, understanding exactly what that implied. Agent Cooper clarified that this wouldn't be a confrontation. It would be controlled, supervised, and monitored through a recording device small enough to hide in clothing. Tyler would receive instructions in real time. He would not be alone, even if it felt like it. Tyler looked overwhelmed, but he didn't look away. I watched him wrestle with the fear shaking his hands and the remorse twisting in his expression. After a long moment, he nodded with a quiet resolve that didn't need words behind it. Agent Cooper placed the device on the table and explained how to wear it, how to move naturally, how to avoid drawing attention. Tyler picked it up with hands that trembled but didn't retreat. When he finally looked at me, his eyes carried a mixture of apology and determination, a silent message that he couldn't undo what had happened, but he could choose what came next. As Agent Cooper guided him toward the door for briefing, the room settled into a tense stillness. For the first time since Jonah disappeared, the path forward depended not on fear, but on someone finally standing up to the man who had controlled them for years. Tyler followed Norman's instructions and drove to the rental house in North Decatur, a pale structure tucked behind overgrown hedges that seemed to shudder with the light breeze. He stepped inside to an air so still, it felt as though the walls were holding their breath. Norman waited near the center of the living room, expression, unreadable eyes following Tyler with a quiet weight that made every movement feel too loud. Without speaking, Norman gestured toward the hallway, expecting Tyler to follow. The floor creaked beneath their steps, a thin sound that only heightened the tension closing in on Tyler's ribs. When they reached the locked door, Norman produced a key and opened it with a deliberate calm that made Tyler's pulse jump. Through the narrow gap, Tyler saw Jonah curled on a small mattress, awake and frightened. The boy's eyes glimmered with confusion as he clutched a pillow like a shield. Tyler's throat tightened. Jonah wasn't harmed, but fear radiated from him as if he sensed the instability around him. Before Tyler could say anything, Norman shut the door with a soft but final click, turning the lock again with the precision of someone protecting not a child, but an idea. Norman walked back toward the living room and began speaking with a tone that held a disquieting certainty. He rambled about Jonah's potential, insisting that the boy needed to be guided toward a future only he could provide. He spoke as though he alone understood a destiny meant for Jonah, each sentence shaped by a rigid conviction that had long since replaced reason. Tyler listened carefully, nodding occasionally, though every instinct inside him screamed to keep distance. As Norman paced, the dim lighting threw shifting shadows across his face, distorting the lines of his expression until menace curled in every angle. Tyler adjusted his jacket out of habit, and the edge of a small bandage peeked out from beneath the collar. Norman's attention snapped to it instantly. He stepped closer, gaze narrowing with sharp suspicion as he studied the faint outline of the bandage. Tyler muttered a quick explanation about an accidental scrape earlier in the day, but Norman didn't answer. The hesitation in his eyes made Tyler's heart hammer. It wasn't the bandage Norman was analyzing, it was Tyler. Norman eventually shifted his stare away, though the suspicion lingered like a shadow clinging to Tyler's skin. He muttered vaguely about loyalty, about how betrayal from within was more dangerous than enemies outside. Every word felt aimed at Tyler, though Norman never said his name. Tyler forced himself to swallow the rising panic and waited until Norman turned slightly toward the kitchen before sliding his phone from his pocket. He shielded the screen with his hand and tapped the location-sharing app, sending a pinpoint to the FBI with a single discreet press. The vibration against his palm confirmed the signal had gone out. He slipped the phone away again just as Norman's gaze flicked back to him. Norman motioned for him to sit at the small kitchen table. The overhead bulb buzzed faintly, flickering as though disturbed by the tension building in the room. Norman spoke again, this time with a more fervent tone, describing how Jonah needed to be molded, protected, kept away from influences that could ruin what he was meant to become. Tyler maintained a neutral expression even as dread twisted through him. Each sentence Norman uttered carried an intensity that bordered on obsession. Without warning, Norman rose from his chair and began checking the house. He locked the front door, tested the knob twice, then moved to the windows, pushing on each frame with firm pressure. Tyler felt the air in the room constrict with every lock, every confirmed seal. Norman then stepped into the hallway and locked the back exit, the metallic click echoing sharply in the enclosed space. When he returned, Norman stopped directly in front of Tyler. For several seconds he didn't speak. He simply watched him with an unreadable calm that sent a cold ripple across Tyler's spine. Finally, Norman said that trust was a fragile commodity now, and that caution was necessary. He pulled a ring of heavy keys from his pocket and turned toward the hallway door. The sound of the bolt sliding into place reverberated through the entire house, sealing Tyler inside with him. As the key turned, Tyler felt the quiet realization pierce through him with chilling clarity. The walls were closing, and he was now locked in the same space as both Jonah and the man who believed fate belonged only to him. The moment I reached the outskirts of North Decatur, I could already sense the tension radiating through the neighborhood. Black SUVs lined the curb, agents moved with measured precision, and a quiet sense of urgency filled the air without a single siren sounding. Special Agent Andre Cooper intercepted me before I crossed the perimeter, speaking in a tone meant to steady rather than restrain, reminding me that my voice might be the one thing capable of grounding Norman long enough to avoid a disastrous outcome. As we approached the staging point, I heard Jonah's soft crying drifting from an upstairs window, a sound so faint yet so piercing it nearly pushed me past the barricade. But Andre placed a hand on my arm, not to stop me, but to signal that timing mattered more than impulse. Through the cracked window, Norman's voice rose and fell, frantic, strained, tangled with conviction and fear. He insisted that no one understood what he was preserving, that Jonah's future required action. Others were too blind to see. His words trembled in a way that told me he was unraveling fast and every second counted. A tactical team positioned themselves along the sides of the small rental house, their movements silent, disciplined, waiting for Andre's signal. The team leader raised 3 fingers, holding them steady as I stepped closer toward the window. My pulse hammered against my ribs, but I kept my expression calm, letting my voice emerge steady enough to cut through Norman's frantic muttering. "Norman," I called softly, careful not to sound confrontational. "I'm here. Jonah hears everything. He needs calm, not chaos." The shifting shadow inside suggested he turned toward the sound of my voice. The silence that followed dragged tight across my nerves, but then he answered not with anger, but with a trembling uncertainty. "It was enough." Andre nodded once toward the team leader, who lowered one finger. I continued speaking, not pleading, but anchoring him with simple, direct sentences that left no room for escalation. I told him Jonah needed comfort, that the room he was in was too small, for fear that every choice he made right now defined what happened next. For a brief moment, Norman's breathing steadied and he muttered something about wanting the right path for Jonah. But then a sudden scrape echoed from deeper inside the house, something falling, something shifting, and the momentary calm shattered. The team leader dropped the last finger. Everything moved in perfect silence. The breach tool connected with the lock, a controlled click that barely carried beyond the doorway. Norman shouted something incoherent, but before panic could ignite, the tactical team surged inside with fluid precision. Commands were firm and clear, layered with professionalism rather than aggression. From where I stood, I couldn't see the details, but I heard the agents confirming Jonah's location, directing Norman to remain still, and announcing each step to avoid misunderstanding. Seconds stacked into what felt like an eternity, until finally an agent appeared at the doorway, guiding Jonah out with gentle assurance. His face was streaked with tears, but he was unharmed, his small arms reaching instinctively for me the moment he saw me. I pulled him close, his heartbeat frantic against my chest, and the shock in his breathing gradually softened into trembling relief. Andre approached with a quiet update that a medical team was ready and waiting to evaluate Jonah. Behind him, more agents escorted Norman out through a separate route, his expression hollow, the determination that once fueled him now drained into resignation. As Jonah clung to me, everything else, agents shouting updates, radios, crackling doors being secured, faded into background noise. All that mattered was that his small hands refused to let go, as if holding on to me was the first safe thing he had felt in hours. I carried him toward the waiting vehicle, knowing that the chaos inside that house would soon be picked apart by investigators. But for me, the world had narrowed to a single unshakable relief. Jonah was safe, and the nightmare that had swallowed our lives had finally broken open into freedom. In the weeks after the rescue, the reality of what had happened settled into the structure of daily life, not as a lingering shock, but as a series of consequences shaped by the laws of the country I now had to navigate with more determination than ever. Federal prosecutors moved quickly, assembling a clear record of Norman's actions and intentions. He was charged with child abduction, coercive conduct, and creating a hazardous situation for a minor, each charge grounded in evidence strong enough that even his own attorneys avoided dramatic defenses. He faced the court without the authority he once wielded over the family, and the legal process stripped away the narratives he had tried to impose on everyone around him. His sentencing would take months, but the restrictions placed on him were immediate and uncompromising. Elaine's involvement was evaluated through a different lens. Her emotional volatility, her pattern of escalating behavior, and her passive compliance with her husband's decisions led the court to mandate long-term psychological treatment and structured supervision. It was not punishment, it was accountability shaped into a protective measure. Mental health specialists were assigned to determine her stability, and she was prohibited from being alone with Jonah until cleared by multiple professionals. The rulings made clear that good intentions did not erase harmful impact. For Evan, the spotlight shifted toward responsibility rather than criminality. His debts, the pressure he had hidden, and his chronic avoidance of boundaries had contributed to the conditions that allowed the situation to escalate. When I filed for sole physical custody, the judge reviewed the full context: his financial instability, his inability to shield our home from external chaos, and the long-standing emotional strain I had documented with the help of counselors. After a detailed evaluation, the court granted me full custody. Evan was assigned a structured visitation schedule with strict oversight, and any future involvement with Jonah would depend on demonstrated stability, not assumptions of parental entitlement. Tyler's role lasted longer in legal paperwork than in emotional relevance. His cooperation with the FBI, his willingness to wear surveillance equipment, and his testimony against Norman placed him firmly on the side of remediation. The court acknowledged the coercion he had been under, and the decisive steps he took once given a chance to correct course. His sentence focused on rehabilitation counseling, community supervision, and mandatory financial planning courses. When he mailed a brief apology through the official victim support channels, I accepted the closure it provided without inviting further contact. Outside the courtroom, life required rebuilding in quiet, steady motions. I signed a lease to a new apartment, bright, small, intentionally peaceful. The windows let in morning light that stretched across the floor, and the silence inside the walls felt like an earned refuge rather than an emptiness. Jonah adapted quickly. He filled the living space with drawings, questions, and a gentle curiosity that had survived the tension he had been forced to endure. We met with child therapists who specialized in early memory and resilience, and they guided me in creating routines that emphasized predictability and emotional safety. Their reassurance anchored me through the difficult moments when fear revisited me without warning. I began attending therapy myself, not as a response to crisis, but as a commitment to clarity. My sessions helped me understand the subtle forms of erosion that years of pressure had caused, how dismissing my own discomfort had slowly reshaped my instincts, how survival had disguised itself as loyalty, and how silence had been encouraged in ways I hadn't recognized until now. As I established new boundaries, I severed ties with Norman's household completely. I changed my phone number, removed shared accounts, instructed the court to route any required communication through official channels, and declined every attempt, direct or indirect, to reframe the past. None of it was personal anymore. It was structural. It was safety. On a quiet night after putting Jonah to bed, I stood beside the window and watched the city lights form a calm, unwavering pattern. For the first time in months, the sound of my own breathing didn't carry tension. The life ahead of us felt honest, unburdened by denial, and grounded in decisions I no longer needed permission to make. And as the weight lifted, one truth settled firmly, a truth I knew I would never compromise again. You can love your family, but you must protect your boundaries, even from the people you once trusted. Thank you for staying with this story. If it spoke to you in any way, I'd truly appreciate your thoughts in the comments and your subscription for more stories that matter.